She gave them 2 hours, actually more than that. That is the first thing to understand about what happened to Rowanne Brewer Lane in May of 2016. An hour and a half on the phone the first time, 40 minutes on the phone the second time, and then a 2.5-hour photo session with a New York Times photographer who traveled to her home because, the reporter told her, they had really liked the interview and wanted images to match the story they were going to tell. She was clear with them throughout every conversation. She told them she wanted her story told the way she was telling it. She told them it would not be a hit piece. They told her multiple times it would not be. She said she was adamant about this. Then the New York Times published the piece on May 14, 2016, under the headline Crossing the Line, How Donald Trump Behaved with Women in Private. And the opening sentence read, Donald J. Trump had barely met Rowanne Brewer Lane when he asked her to change out of her clothes. She watched the story go national. She watched cable news pick it up. She watched Donald Trump's team start calling the story a fraud. She watched the story become the biggest political flashpoint of the week. She watched herself become, in a single news cycle, the face of an argument she had never intended to make, and then watched herself become, in the news cycle immediately following, the instrument of Donald Trump's counterattack, appearing on Fox News, CNN, CBSN, Inside Edition, and Sean Hannity's program to say over and over that she had not had a negative experience with Donald Trump. I'm extremely upset, she told Inside Edition. Basically, they lied to me. 2 hours of interviews. 2 days of being used by everyone. She went on Fox and Friends. She went on CNN. She went on CBSN. She went on Sean Hannity's show. She went on Inside Edition. In each appearance, she said substantially the same thing. She had not had a negative experience with Donald Trump. The Times had taken her words and put a negative connotation on them, and she wanted the record to reflect what she had actually told the reporters, not what the reporters had done with what she told them. In each appearance, she was clear and composed and specific. In each appearance, the hosts asked her variations of the same question. Had the Times lied, or had Trump been inappropriate? She answered consistently. The Times had misrepresented her, and Trump had not done anything she experienced as wrong. The irony that nobody on any of those programs noted directly was this. She was defending Donald Trump on Fox News, which is exactly the outcome the Trump campaign needed from the story she was supposedly in to correct. She came forward on her own. She said so explicitly she had not been coordinated with or briefed by anyone from the campaign. But the effect of her voluntary intervention was to give Trump's team a weapon they then wielded loudly. She did not create that irony. She was caught inside it. That is the real story of Rowanne Brewer Lane, not what Donald Trump said to her at a pool party in 1990, but what the machinery of American political media did to her 26 years later, using her own words, her own experience, and her own genuinely held feelings about a man she had briefly cared for, and turning all of it into ammunition for two sides of a battle she never entered voluntarily and never fully escaped. Rowanne Brewer was born on July 7, 1964, in Miami, Florida. She grew up in Virginia and attended Herndon High School in Reston, graduating in 1982. The path from Herndon to the front page of the New York Times ran through the specific circuits of 1980s beauty and entertainment culture. Modeling in her 20s, the Miss USA competition in 1988 where she represented Maryland and finished in the top 10, losing eventually to Miss Texas Courtney Gibbs, who won the title that year, and then the Star Search talent competition in 1989, where she competed in the spokesmodel category and won 3 consecutive times. She appeared on the cover of multiple magazines. She won a Best Body on the Beach competition. She built the kind of modeling career that was visible enough to open doors in entertainment without quite being large enough to sustain a permanent presence there. The Star Search wins in 1989 are worth pausing on because they reveal something about who Rowanne Brewer was before she became Rowanne Brewer Lane, and before she became the opening anecdote of a presidential election story in the New York Times. Star Search was television's premier talent competition of the 1980s and early 1990s, the platform that launched or accelerated the careers of people including Beyoncé, Britney Spears, Justin Timberlake, and Alanis Morissette, among many others. in different years. The spokesmodel category was exactly what it sounds like. Contestants were judged on their ability to present products, to speak clearly and persuasively on camera, to hold attention in a 30-second format. Rowanne won 3 consecutive times. That is not an accident or a fluke. That is a woman who had a specific documented skill at presenting information in a way that made people want to keep watching her. She brought that skill to every interview she gave in May 2016. Whatever else was happening in the chaos of that week, the basic fact of her television presence was impressive. She was clear, composed, specific, and articulate. She did not seem to be reading from talking points. She seemed to be saying what she actually believed, in real time, with the confidence of someone who had been doing exactly this kind of direct-to-camera communication since Ronald Reagan was in his second term. The tragedy of the situation, if it deserves that word, is that she was deploying her real skills in service of a situation she had never asked to be in. By 1990, she was 26 years old and working the social circuit that Miami and Palm Beach provided for women in her position. Parties, events, the specific social geography where successful and very wealthy men and photogenic young women occupied the same spaces with a frequency that was not incidental. On a night in late 1990, she was at Mar-a-Lago for a pool party. Donald Trump was 44 years old, in the middle of his divorce from Ivana. The proceedings were ongoing. The tabloid coverage of the split had been extraordinary, and Trump was in the specific position of a newly single, enormously wealthy man who ran his own social events at his own private estate. He had been separated for several months. He noticed Rowanne Brewer. What happened next is the event at the center of the entire controversy, and it is worth being precise about what every source, including Rowanne herself, actually agrees happened. Trump struck up a conversation with her. After about 20 minutes, he asked if she had a swimsuit with her. She said she didn't. He asked if she wanted one. She said she would. He took her to a room with drawers full of swimsuits. She selected one. She changed, and she returned to the pool. When she appeared at poolside, Trump turned to the assembled guests and said, "Now that's a stunning Trump girl right there." These facts are not disputed by any party. What followed the pool incident is also not in significant dispute. Rowanne and Trump began dating. The romance lasted several months. Some sources say 3 months. Others suggest it extended into early 1991. She saw him in New York and in Palm Beach. She met him in the context a man in his position occupies: his properties, his events, his social world. She described the relationship across multiple interviews in 2016 as genuinely warm. She said he was kind to her. She said he was gracious. She said he charmed her mother. She eventually ended the relationship and moved to Los Angeles to pursue her acting career, and the geography was too much for the romance to survive. None of this fits the story of a woman who had an experience she later wished had never happened. It fits the story of a woman who had a brief and real relationship with a complicated man, remembered it fondly, moved on with her life, and 26 years later found herself explaining that remembered fondness to the national media. The Times was not interested in the fondness. The Times was interested in the first 20 minutes. What is disputed is the interpretation of those first 20 minutes. The New York Times, in its article, described the scene as a debasing face-to-face encounter and called Trump's behavior toward Brewer Lane unsettling conduct. The paper's opening sentence framed the event through implication. A reader encountering that sentence without further context would form one impression. A reader who received all available context would form a more complicated one. Brewer Lane's own description of the same events was straightforwardly positive. She told Fox News she had been flattered by Trump's comment at the pool. She said he never made her feel demeaned in any way. She described him as very gracious, kind, thoughtful, generous, a gentleman. She said she was not wearing a swimsuit. He asked if she wanted one. She accepted. She put it on. And he said something complimentary. She had no problem with any of that at the time, and she had no problem with it in 2016. Here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. The reporter for the New York Times, Michael Barbaro, said on CNN the day after Brewer Lane went on Fox News, "None of the facts are in dispute." He then said, The big picture here is the way Donald Trump interacts privately with women. That was the purpose of our story. The Times issued a written statement. Ms. Brewer Lane was quoted fairly, accurately, and at length. The story provides context for the reader, including that the swimsuit scene was the start of a whirlwind romance between Ms. Brewer Lane and Mr. Trump. And Barbero said something else on CBS this morning that went somewhat less noticed than the rest. Recall in my interview with her, she basically expressed that I was taken aback by this. And I think that's how we depicted it. Taken aback, not devastated, not humiliated, not demeaned, taken aback. In the moment, at a party in 1990, when a man she had known for 20 minutes handed her a swimsuit and then showed her off to his guests, she was taken aback. She also proceeded to date him for several months afterward. She also described him, over multiple interviews in 2016, as someone she genuinely cared for. She also said she still had fond memories of the romance. Both things were true simultaneously. The taken aback is the thing the Times saw in what she told them. The fond memories and the not a negative experience are what she wanted the record to say. Both were accurate descriptions of different dimensions of the same experience. The Times chose one. Brewer Lane chose the other. Trump, watching the resulting chaos from his campaign operation, chose hers. She had gone to the New York Times because she had an experience she was willing to share. She described it honestly, including, apparently, a momentary reaction of surprise that Barbero heard and wrote down. The story got published. The moment that surprised her 26 years earlier got foregrounded as debasing. She was not happy. She said so loudly on every platform that invited her. What she did not say, on any of those platforms, was that her experience with Trump was negative. The distinction matters, and is rarely made cleanly in the coverage of the controversy. She objected to the Times' framing. She did not object to what had happened. She did not say Trump had behaved badly toward her. She said the Times had behaved badly toward her. These are different accusations, aimed at different targets, and in the blizzard of coverage that followed, with Fox News booking her, CNN covering the booking, and Trump calling the CNN control room personally to make sure they had seen it, those distinctions were not always preserved. She had, before all of this, lived a fairly full life. After the brief romance with Trump ended, she moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting, and the relationship didn't survive the geography. She dated several notable people. She was engaged for 3 years in the early 1990s to Mohammed Hadid, a real estate developer who would later become known as the father of supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid. The engagement didn't lead to marriage. She had small parts in films. Her biggest credit was the 1992 comedy Round Trip to Heaven with Corey Feldman, and she appeared in television shows including South Beach and a guest appearance on Murphy Brown. She never quite broke through in the way that her television exposure and consistent physical presence in the entertainment world might have suggested she would. She eventually moved back east. In 1996, she married Johnny Lane, the lead singer of the hair metal band Warrant, whose biggest hit, Cherry Pie, had made him a specific kind of famous in the early 1990s. Warrant had been part of the wave of Los Angeles glam metal bands that dominated MTV in the late 1980s and early 1990s before the arrival of Nirvana, and the grunge movement essentially ended the commercial reign of that genre. By the time Rowanne and Johnny married in 1996, the genre's commercial moment had passed, and Lane was navigating the specific difficulty of being someone who had been very famous in a narrow window and was now something less. They had a daughter named Madison Michelle Lane in 1997, a daughter Rowanne has described in multiple interviews with evident warmth and pride. They divorced in 2005 after 9 years of marriage. Johnny Lane's struggle with alcoholism was documented in multiple accounts from people who knew him and worked with him across his career. He had been to treatment multiple times. He had spoken about the struggle in interviews. On August 11, 2011, he was found dead in a Comfort Inn hotel room in Woodland Hills, California. He was 47 years old. The cause was acute alcohol poisoning. His daughter Madison was 14. Rowanne Brewer Lane spent the years between 2005 and 2016 raising Madison in North Carolina, building her business, and living the kind of life that people who have been peripherally famous and then stepped away from that world live. Private, functional, occasionally complicated, substantially removed from the celebrity circuits that had once defined her social world. By 2016, she was 51 years old, living in North Carolina with her now teenage daughter. She had agreed to speak to the Times because a reporter asked her about a memory from 26 years earlier, because she had genuinely positive feelings about that memory, and because she apparently believed that sharing those positive feelings would result in a story that reflected them. The story instead reflected the pattern the Times was documenting: Trump's consistent habit of commenting on women's bodies, of treating female appearance as something to be assessed and displayed, of turning women in his social environment into objects for his appraisal and public presentation. The pattern was real. The Times documented it through 50 interviews conducted over 6 weeks by two of the paper's most serious reporters, Michael Barbaro, who would later become the host of the paper's flagship podcast, and Megan Twohey, who would later share a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on Harvey Weinstein that helped launch the Me Too movement. The pattern they documented included Trump going backstage at Miss USA pageants to inspect contestants while they were changing, something Trump himself later described casually on The Howard Stern Show, which is where the claim gained its most direct confirmation from Trump's own voice. It included Trump commenting obsessively on female employees' weight and appearance, something multiple former employees described consistently. It included him calling women demeaning names in professional settings, assigning nicknames based on physical characteristics, and repeatedly seeking out younger women for romantic and social contact in ways that a significant number of the women interviewed described as uncomfortable at minimum. The 50 women the Times interviewed did not all describe the same experience. Some described warm interactions. Some described professional respect. Some described discomfort that fell short of anything legally actionable. Some described something worse. Rowanne Brewer Lane was not in the worst category. She was not, by her own account, in any negative category at all. She was, as the Times described it, the start of a whirlwind romance, and the romance, by her own account, was pleasant while it lasted. Rowanne Brewer Lane was not one of the women who described discomfort. She was not one of the women who said Trump had behaved inappropriately. She was instead a woman who had a personal and romantic experience with Trump that she remembered warmly, who agreed to tell that story to the Times, and whose momentary reaction of being taken aback in 1990 was heard and noted by the reporter and used as part of a larger documentation of a real pattern. The Times was not wrong about the pattern. The Times noted that Brewer Lane's momentary reaction existed. What Brewer Lane felt, and feels, is that the note was used in a way that served the story's thesis more than it served her own account of her life. This is a genuinely difficult journalistic question. 50 women were interviewed for the Times piece. Their accounts collectively documented something the reporting substantiated across decades. Brewer Lane's account was included not as evidence of trauma, but as the scene-setting opening, chosen precisely because it was at Mar-a-Lago, because it involved a swimsuit, because the image of a man newly separated from his wife handing a bikini to a woman he had known for 20 minutes had a visual quality that journalism uses to open a story. Donald J. Trump had barely met Rowanne Brewer Lane when he asked her to change out of her clothes is a sentence designed to make someone read the next sentence. The sentence is also, by any reasonable account of what the reporter himself said, a version of what Brewer Lane told him, that she was taken aback in the moment. The sentence does not say she was assaulted. It does not say she was harmed. It says he asked her to change out of her clothes when he had barely met her. That is what happened. She agrees that is what happened. She disputes only the implication, and the implication is where journalism lives. What Trump did with Brewer Lane's pushback is also instructive, because it reveals how the same machinery that the Times had deployed against him was immediately and effectively repurposed in the opposite direction. He watched Fox News that Monday morning. He saw her on Fox and Friends saying the Times had lied. He called CNN's control room personally, a sitting presidential candidate calling a television network's production room to make sure they knew about the Fox interview. The producer who took the call told CNN's own reporter that the call was surreal. Presidential candidates do not call television control rooms. Trump did. He tweeted a barrage of responses. The @New York Times is so dishonest. Their hit piece cover story on me yesterday was just blown up by Rowanne Brewer, who said it was a lie. He initially misspelled her first name as Roseanne in some tweets which were later deleted. He said she had blown up the story. He said she had exposed the article as a fraud. He called it a failing newspaper. He repeated the word fraud multiple times across multiple platforms in multiple hours. Washington Post media critic Eric Wemple pushed back on the coverage of the pushback, writing that the reaction against the Times story was laughable, and noting, "Lane's recollections are one thing, the bare facts of the situation are another. The New York Times is entitled to judge and interpret the goings-on." He did not say Brewer Lane was wrong about her own feelings. He said the Times was entitled to its interpretation of what the facts meant. Both things, again, could be simultaneously true. She was, in the space of 48 hours, used by the New York Times to open a story about patterns of behavior toward women, and then used by Donald Trump to declare that story a fraud. Both of them used what she had actually said, selected for the purpose they needed it to serve. Neither of them was lying about what she had said. Both of them were doing exactly what political and media machinery does, finding the true thing that serves the current objective and leading with that, confident that the fuller picture will get lost in the volume. The thing nobody paused to acknowledge, amid all of this, was the specific reality of Rowanne Brewer Lane's position. She had agreed to be interviewed by the Times because she wanted to tell a positive story about a man she had cared for. She had spent more than 4 hours in conversation with reporters because she wanted to be clear and accurate and generous in her characterization. The story had been published in a way she experienced as a betrayal. She had then gone on television to correct it, loudly and repeatedly. And Donald Trump had seized her correction, amplified it through his own media apparatus, and used it as a weapon, without calling her, without coordinating with her, just using her public words for his public purposes the same way the Times had used her interview for its public purposes. She said explicitly on Fox News that she had not spoken with anyone from the campaign. "I have not spoken with anyone from the campaign about this." She came forward on her own, in her own anger at the Times, for her own reasons. Trump then absorbed her anger into his campaign narrative and announced she had blown up the story. She had not been consulted. She was not part of the campaign. She was a private citizen in North Carolina whose 26-year-old memory had been converted, without her permission and without her coordination, into a presidential campaign event. In the interviews she gave across that week in May 2016, something is visible beneath the righteous anger at the Times. A woman who is saying, with increasing intensity, that she would like to be the person who tells her own story. She gave the Times 2 hours because she wanted to control her story. She went on every television program because she wanted to control her story. She said, "I was adamant that my story be told the way I was telling it," because she had been explicit, in real time, about wanting her own account to be the account. What she discovered over those 2 days was that her story had never been fully available for her to control, not when the Times needed an opening anecdote for a presidential election piece, and not when Donald Trump needed a prop for his media counterattack. There is a version of the Rowanne Brewer Lane story that focuses entirely on whether the Times was fair to her, and that version is a real story with a genuine argument at its center. There is another version that focuses entirely on whether Trump's behavior at a pool party in 1990 constituted something worth documenting, and that version is also a real story. The version that gets told least often is the one about what happens to a private person in North Carolina who agreed to talk to a reporter about a memory from 26 years ago and discovered that the memory now belonged to everyone except her. She gave the Times 2 hours because she thought that much time would be enough to make her meaning clear. It wasn't. She went on Fox and CNN and CBSN and Hannity because she thought that much airtime would be enough to correct the record. It wasn't quite enough for that either. The story remained in the record the way the Times told it because that is how journalism works, and her correction remained in the record too, and both exist simultaneously for anyone who wants to look. She gave 2 hours to the Times. She was very clear about what she wanted. She was adamant. And her story was never entirely hers to tell. What the full record of Rowanne Brewer Lane's experience reveals is not a secret hatred for what Trump told her. The record shows no such hatred. The record shows something considerably harder to contain in a simple formulation. A woman who had a genuine experience with a powerful man, who wanted to describe that experience on her own terms, who found that neither side of a political conflict was interested in her terms, only in the portions of her experience that served their respective arguments at a specific moment in a presidential campaign. The Times needed her to illustrate a pattern because the piece required a vivid opening scene, and her story provided one. Trump needed her to refute the Times because his campaign needed to demonstrate that the newspaper had manufactured a narrative, and her anger at the paper provided that too. The 50 other women interviewed for the piece continued to be part of the record, unaffected by Brewer Lane's pushback, because the story was never actually dependent on any single account. It was the accumulation of 50 accounts, and removing one from the center of the stage did not dismantle what the other 49 described. She was, throughout all of this, a real person, with a real life and real feelings about a specific set of experiences that were hers. The swimsuit, the compliment, the months of dating, the fond memories, the startled moment that Barbero heard and wrote down, all of it was real, and all of it was true. And the full version of it is more complicated than either the Times' framing or her own pushback fully captured. This is usually how it works when real experience gets translated into political argument. The translation captures something and loses something, and the person whose experience is being translated spends a lot of energy trying to recover what got left out. She gave 2 hours to the Times because she thought she could control what got left out. She couldn't. Nobody can, when the story they're telling has been selected for purposes larger than their own. She discovered that loudly, in public, across 48 hours in May 2016. The discovery itself is the thing the story was always actually about. That is not a secret she carried. It is a condition she encountered. And the fact that the title of this story promised you a secret hatred that the record does not contain is itself a small demonstration of exactly what happened to her. The framing chose the most emotionally compelling version, and the fuller truth required more words than a headline allows. If this made you think differently about what you thought you already knew about 2016 and the media that covered it, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell. There are more of these, and they go fast. Drop a comment below and be specific. Did the Times treat her fairly, or did Trump use her cynically? Or is the honest answer both? That's not a rhetorical question. There's a real argument here, and we want to see it in the comments. Share this with someone who remembers that week in 2016 and thinks they know what happened. Let them read it first and form their view.